during our clinical trials. So I do a lot of storytelling from things that happened to me in my real life. So what happened to me in my real life before we make this a story about racism is that my husband and I bought a house in Baltimore with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes all around the porch. And when we bought this house in October, we couldn't wait until spring to decorate our porch and really the whole yard, but to plant in these flower boxes. So spring came, we ran out, look at our flower boxes, getting ready to plant our marigold seeds. And we noticed that some of the boxes were empty, while some of the boxes had dirt in them already. Well, so to deal with the empty boxes, my husband goes down to the gardening store and he hauls big old bags of potting soil and fills up the empty boxes. And then we put equal numbers of our marigold seeds in all of the boxes, and we water them. And I am not the gardener in the family, so I sit back just going to see what happens, right? 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door looking at my porch, and I stopped in my tracks because it looked to me like we had planted completely different species in some boxes compared to the others. Some of the boxes were full of plants, and not only were they full of plants, they were tall, vigorous plants. And some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the potting soil had sprouted, with the strong seed growing very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But in that poor rocky soil, the weak seed had died, and the strongest seed in that poor rocky soil had to still struggle to make it to a middling height. And so if you are gardeners in this audience, maybe you've composted half of your gardens, and so maybe you've seen this with your own real eyes. Clearly what I'm describing is about the importance of the environment, the importance of the soil. But now I'm going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now I'm going to have a gardener with two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed produces red blossoms, and some of the seed produces pink blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She puts the red seed in the rich, fertile soil, the pink seed in the poor, rocky soil, and 3 weeks later, she sees in her garden what I saw in mine. In the rich, fertile soil, all of the red seed is sprouted. The strong seed is grown tall and vigorous. Even the weak red seed makes it halfway up. In the poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died, and here comes the strong pink seed, struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener comes and she's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, "You know, I was right to prefer red over pink." So that first part of the story illustrates how institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. Well, let's pick the story back up and say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking at red, loving red, thinking it's just fabulous, looks over at pink and says, "Oh, those flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly," so she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where is internalized racism in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, really many of them not understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee bzzz, into one of the pink flowers, then bzzz, into another pink flower, and then bzzz, to this other flower, and that pink flower says, "Get away from me, bee. Do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red," because the pink flowers have internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in the garden? Well, first we could address the internalized racism, and we could say, go over to the pink flowers and say, "Pink is beautiful, power to the pink." And that's an important intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. So maybe we can address the personally mediated racism. So maybe we can have a conversation with the gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So in our workshop, we say, "Dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers?" And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we want to set things right in the garden, we have to at least address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep the boxes separate, that's all right too, although it makes it easier going forward for the gardener to keep segregating resources. But if we keep separate boxes, it means we have to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, we may also address the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And we may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children growing up and seeing the flowers equally beautiful would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and to very strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized racism. And when we do, the other levels would take care of themselves. Just to say I haven't talked about who is the gardener, that's a very important question. That's the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Clearly, government is part of the gardener, as our media, as our foundations, as our corporations, as our pharmaceutical companies, anybody, even communities, to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it's dangerous if the gardener is allied with one group. I paint her red, that's why she prefers red over pink. And it's equally dangerous when the gardener can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, because she's not really counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of things we can say. I would say that I would think that Morehouse School of Medicine and Pfizer and a partnership there would be a very nice thing in terms of gardener diversification. But anyway, so that all was about why we do not need to biologize race. And we need to recognize and rectify racism, that it's alive and well, in terms of understanding what we need to do in terms of clinical trials. The last point, providing resources according to need, is all about partnership. So to close, I wanted to frame this discussion of diversity in clinical trials using a definition of health equity that says achieving health equity requires valuing all individuals and populations equally. That means inclusion of patients, providers, investigators, and community. Recognizing and rectifying historical injustice is not just acknowledging the horrors of the US Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee, but also recognizing that racism is alive and well, and that accounts for some of the biological diversity we see, not race as genes, and maybe even exploring the accelerated aging hypothesis. And finally, the third aspect of achieving health equity, providing resources according to need, as a very strong basis for partnership, especially with premier institutions like the Morehouse School of Medicine that have so many resources to bring to bear. Thank you very much.